Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Hello, welcome back. Here I am in front of the Australian bar, where I spend quite a few evenings with Mrs. Craig and others. In suburban Twickenham, Southwest London, another episode of the Scandal Mongers. Well, oh gosh, a lot to cram in today, so I will not detain you long with some of my long introductions, in which I inform you of my opinions about various things, or as my kids say, Dad going on about stuff. Yes, well, some people quite like it, some people are not so sure. Last week's show, Giles Milton, what a lovely man, what a great storyteller. It's such an interesting program. If you haven't listened to it or watched it, please do. I think you'll find it fascinating. Just full of great stories and colour and real insight into a period that I think we're all still fascinated by, at least I am, which of course is the Second World War. Linda Smith, 383, she was impressed. And she also says, the fly on the wall that I know of during World War II was my great uncle. He spent 24/7 with Churchill and left 700 pages of notes about his time there as a bodyguard, and I've written about this under my pen name of Linda Stoker. There you are. So interesting. Giovanna Maruzzi, I'm guessing he's from Italy. Maybe I'm wrong. Always a pleasure, she says, to hear the podcasts, including the preambles. Well, that's nice. Take that, kids. I found, like you, Phil, the Wales' video very touching, maybe on the saccharine side, but the intended message of family unity, affection, and comfort in the face of adversity was palpable. Hope you're enjoying the green Welsh countryside. Well, I was in Wales last week. As somebody who's part of the Italian Welsh community in South Wales, I must say rain has its charm. Rain aside, I'm sorry, it has its charm. Okay, so she is Italian, but living in Wales. Thanks for being in touch, Giovanna. Our old mate, Jonathan Brewer, was excited to hear that we're having Simon Heffer on the show soon. On hearing the name Simon Heffer, Jonathan says, my Scandalous Mongers podcast taste buds are tingling. Looking forward to his views on the abdication and on Andrew's bio. He means Andrew Loney. Interesting. I think Andrew Loney and Simon Heffer might not agree on everything to do with the abdication. So when I get Andrew back, and he has promised to come back, we'll be able to put Simon's points to him and see what he says. So a lot to cram in, so I'll get on with it fairly quickly. Rather a topical show today. Both of the interviews are about things that are really in the news. I'm going to start with our friend Clive Irving with a royal update, because it's the second anniversary of Charles becoming king. It's Harry's 40th birthday, received a lot of attention. And also, there was a really remarkable article, actually, series of articles in the American media about Harry and Meghan this week. It started with the Hollywood Reporter, which ran a story, the latest of many, that said that they're finding it very hard to retain staff. It was called Why Hollywood Keeps Quitting on Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. And they said that their sources told them that their employees are terrified of Meghan. And we've heard these stories before. Valentine Lowe has been on this podcast 2 or 3 times. He really broke the story of the so-called Sussex Survivors Club. And I've always believed there's a lot in that. People will know I'm more sympathetic to Harry than perhaps many of people watching and listening to this, especially in his battles with the press. And we'll talk to Clive about that in a minute, I'm sure. But I do think that a lot of what drove the initial breach was problems that Meghan was having with the staff and they were having with her. And then I think that's a fairly, tawdry and embarrassing thing. So it was all gusset up into something massive about racism and slavery and all that Netflix rubbish. Well, actually, I think it was people just not getting on with each other, which is familiar and domestic and rather ordinary. Anyway, the Daily Beast, which Clive Irving works for, looked into the Hollywood Reporter. Now, the Daily Beast is much more pro-Harry traditionally, and is very sceptical of the British tabloids and supports Harry in his crusade against them, as I do. Sorry, this is very complicated. So many different factions. But it was quite interesting. The Daily Beast did actually come to the conclusion that there's something in this story about people working for them in America being unhappy. But they found that actually it was an unhappiness with Harry as much as Meghan. And they spoke about somebody who maybe has only just given testimony. Again, it's anonymous, but I think the Daily Beast is a very respectable outlet. And this was somebody they got to who said it was very exciting to be asked to present my work for their wedding back in 2018. 2017, 2018, gosh, I've forgotten. Anyway, this person was excited to be asked to present as a possible photographer. I went into Kensington Palace, she says, I think it's a woman, where I laid out my mood boards in their office. Eventually, Meghan just walked in, didn't speak to me, took one look at what I prepared and said, no, and walked out again. It was horrible. Well, I mean, maybe this is just a difference of the way people behave in business and life in, the world that Meghan worked in before and the royal family. I don't know. There's always been something in this story. It's undeniable that she does have a problem with staff, and they've just lost their latest chief of staff after the 3-month trial. Or again, this is Josh Kettler, I think his name is Josh Kettler. Here, it's said that he couldn't get on with Harry. Who knows what really happened? But it's clearly an issue. So where do we stand now with Harry and with Charles? There was this opinion poll, which I thought was really interesting, that in America, now a lot of Americans listen to this show and they won't agree with this, but in America, according to this poll, commissioned by the Times in London, Harry is more popular than his father, although not quite as popular as William. Does this matter? Well, I think it does, because I think the fact that they made such a big deal of racism and anti-colonialism and going on all these visits to countries that are led by people who are very strongly outspoken on these issues, it's sent a big signal to the world. And it's something that I personally think the royal family needs to worry about. Sure, they'll maintain the affection of most of Britain for a long time, I'm sure of it. But if the idea gets rooted in the international imagination that there's the kind of old-fashioned white royal family that's all about tradition and history and some of the darker things in history, like slavery, which we all know was connected to the royal family many years ago. And then there's a separate faction, these kind of young, cool royals who are much more kind of comfortable in a multiracial world. And in that battle outside the UK, I'd say Harry and Meghan, well, they're not doing too badly if this opinion poll is to be believed, especially in America. Look, as ever, I don't expect you to agree. We mentioned Christopher Hitchens. I mentioned him in my last introduction, a friend of mine. And he always said the hardest thing in politics was to disagree with someone on your own side. That incredibly complicated thing of distinguishing between positions is what he said, on your own side of politics. Or on your own side of an issue like, say, Harry and Meghan, William and Kate. It's, I think social media has made that even harder. You're on one side, the other side's always bad, and everything that your side does is great. And we all know life isn't really like that, and neither should be politics, and neither should be our views about the issues we talk about here on this podcast and elsewhere. So I did do a rant in the end, didn't I? Couldn't stop myself. Anyway, enough from me. Let's go and talk to Clive, and stick with me, and we're going to get to a really fascinating part 2, which will be a bit longer, I think, with my friend Nick Bryant, talking about America's endless war with itself, which will also be controversial, but in a slightly different way. Okay, see you in a minute. Bye. Clive, thank you for joining me to celebrate the 40th birthday of Harry, amongst other things.
Well, yeah, I think, Phil, this is a good example of all the distractions that draw attention away from the real story about the monarchy. I mean, it doesn't, the internal dynamics of whether the brothers are talking to each other, what Camilla thinks about the king's illness, that's kind of doesn't really matter. What matters is that we're 2 years into this this kingship, and nothing has really changed. Now, part of that is because obviously in the last year, the court has had to contend with the king's infirmity. That sounds like an 18th century problem, doesn't it? Coping with the king's infirmity. But obviously it's a serious situation. We still don't know what kind of cancer the king is suffering from. But my point is really that the monarchy is yet to make the transformation from an imperial monarchy to a post-imperial monarchy. And that was, in a sense, postponed by the presence of the Queen, who couldn't make that change, constitutionally unable to manage a change of that scale. And we were left hoping that the heir would have the sense of the time, the sense of the century and what it demands, the changes that have taken place to the country, because he had talked about this in the past, about in loose terms of modernizing the monarchy, but it's a really fundamental institutional shift that's necessary in that the rest of the country has made that journey from imperial to post-imperial long ago. All the institutions of the country are no longer in any way tied to the imperial past. And moreover, we've been overtaken by the urgencies of the moment, particularly with the new government, when there's a lot of belt tightening going on, and you've got an institution as opulent as this one, which seems to know nothing about belt tightening. And in the year before he fell ill, the king showed really no grasp of this and no energy in dealing with it. In fact, no appreciation of it. And when uncomfortable truths came up, which are associated with imperial monarchy, like about slavery, they seemed unprepared to deal with their own history and their own role in slavery. And that may have not mattered a lot in the UK, but it certainly had a very bad effect here in America and in other parts of the
well, I wanted to talk about that because and I think there is a connection between the slightly tabloid interest, which I confess to having now and again, in the brothers and who's talking to who and who's posting what. There's a connection between that and the bigger, more constitutional, more historic things that you love to talk about. And I think the connection is Meghan, because if anything could signal a new start, a new accommodation with a multiracial world, it was the first non-white member of the family. And look how that turned out. So I think that's the chances of a reconciliation, which I love to talk to you about, I think could actually be an important part of the thing that you'd like to see.
Yeah, if the court is capable of understanding that, because basically Meghan was rejected like some kind of infection in the blood system, that they took some kind of drug to reject it. And she and Harry at the beginning were extremely well placed to do that, to signal that and do that, and take on a role with a generation that they were part of, which the king obviously could not do.
Well, it's interesting. There was a poll, YouGov were commissioned by the Times to do a big poll, and it turned out that Harry is actually quite a lot more popular in America, as you just suggested he would be, than he is in Britain, but he's quite unpopular. In fact, he's more popular than the king in America. And I think that a lot of people who watch this podcast tend to be rather hostile to Harry and Meghan. And I think sometimes they've made that quite easy to be hostile to them. I mean, I suspect there's big questions about the way she's behaved behind closed doors. And I think some of the things in the Netflix series were a little bit over the top and exaggerated. But despite all that, it's kind of worked. It's like there's this kind of unofficial royal family that the rest of the world likes, and the old-fashioned royal family that we in Britain are still clinging to.
Well, that has a lot to do with the palace's relationship with the media, and the way that the palace manages the media rather than the media manages the palace. And I sometimes think that a lot of the British journalists should be given a royal warrant as purveyors of triviality to the royal household, because there are very few journalists, it seemed to me, having the kind of discussion that you and I are having now. And it does have, I think it has a very urgent line to it, in the sense that you've got a landslide election result, a new government which is finally having to come to terms with what it's necessary to do to fix all the things in Britain that are broken. And most of the things that are broken in Britain have to do with the quality of life of its people. A broken health service, broken social services, broken care for the aged, and a lot of things that people are immediately involved in themselves and are conscious that they're having to manage and deal with themselves. And so Starmer's taken the line that it'll get worse before it gets better, which is the only thing he can possibly say, really, because as a bromide, because it's going to feel tighter before it gets better. But a whole group of people who have not been paying their whack in taxes and to support the system have now got to do that. What's happened to the royal finances is fascinating. Simultaneously, they've become very, very rich because they've had this windfall from the seabed rights that they're busy selling off for the use of wind farms. I mean, it's estimated that but for the next 10 years, they can raise they will get an income of about £9 billion for something that they have to do nothing about. It's not anything that they have to do to earn that money. Because of these ancient rights going back to the Normans, basically, the ancient sea rights, they are now going to collect this massive windfall. You could build an awful lot of new hospitals for £9 billion.
Well, is there any sign that they might decide, just out the goodness of their hearts, to make a gesture rather than being kind of forced by the government?
Well, let's suggest this then. I think the phrase occurs to me is, how can we help? That would be a simple message from the court to the Prime Minister. How can we help? Because they could help a great deal. Apart from, it's not just dismantling the opulence of the royal omnibus, which continues to be on an extremely extravagant level, the surplus of palaces, none of these things are not necessary to sustain the essential myth, or if you like, the fantasy that the monarchy enjoys because it includes the head of state, who is a nominal head of state, part of a romance with British history. All of that stuff doesn't need to be harmed or dismantled if you can successfully match a sense of reality with a sense of fantasy. That's the challenge, I suppose, really. So out of touch is what I feel would be the final. If I was a schoolmaster giving the final end of year term report on the last 2 years of this king, I would say needs to do more.
Interesting. I don't know whether you feel that the latest communication from Catherine, which I thought was rather moving, I have to say, but I'm a little bit of a softie and tend to be sentimental. Did you think that was an interesting modern new way of communicating with the public, or just another piece of the sort of the softer and less substantial part of what the royals do?
Well, I think it's both. I think it was extremely well done and extremely moving, and it had a huge effect here in America, where she is. By the way, she's an extremely popular figure in America, more so than William. William's less. People feel that they know him less than they know her, and it was something that she was sharing with many other victims of the same problem, and she shared it with genuine, authentic feeling and conviction, and she dedicated herself to manage the problem with her own children, which is something that lots of people will sympathize and empathize with. She managed that extremely well. So as a piece of genuine emotional contact, it far exceeded anything that the king has ever been capable of in conveying emotional contact with people. The king is governed in part by a neediness, things that he's always needed personally, comforts he's always needed. He's also governed by a sometimes unruly temper, a kind of short fuse, a characteristic which, of course, occurs in the male line of the Windsors. George V had it and George VI had it, and Camilla manages it, as she says. She's managed it pretty well, but it's not a good feature of when the king's well, at least. One does sympathize deeply with him now. But by the way, this is another problem here with both Catherine and the king is, why don't we know what kind of cancer it is? I mean, why is there a news blackout on the one essential? What's the problem of telling the people?
It's a good question. I mean, is it any of our business? A lot of people would say.
Yeah, well, of course it's our business, but it's a vast public institution. You don't have the same rights of privacy in that business as you do if you're a private person. It's part of the obligation of public service. It's what public service involves and is all about.
Few people look at the roles, I think, with your historical and constitutional kind of depth of knowledge, and that's why it's always so interesting to talk to you, Clive. I think, I mean, my own feeling, we have talked about this, is that I think the reason we're both quite sympathetic to Harry is his crusade against the press, because I think we both say that the excesses of the tabloid press are one of the great unaddressed crimes, really, that marked decades of our life in this country.
Yes.
And he is doing something, I think, rather wonderful in pushing them and pushing them. And the last time we spoke, you said that there may well come a time when Mr. Murdoch himself has to go into court. Has there been any more on that? Anything else?
Well, yeah, a lot more on this. And this is a very interesting subject because when the 40th birthday thing came up, it's been. I was surprised that this wasn't brought into the question of Harry's relationship with the family and what its impact is on the monarchy. Now, this, because he's so well endowed financially, of all the people who got claims to on the Murdoch newspapers for the hacking, he came to this as the most formidable opponent, really. So it's a kind of adversarial situation between one person now. Since it's all been, there are now 40 claimants left, and this last round of claims has to be settled before January the 7th. Actually, I think it's 4:30 p.m. on January the 4th when they have to resolve what can be admitted in a trial, and then trial goes ahead 3 days later. So he's playing this giant game of chicken where he's facing off with the Murdoch lawyers, and the Murdoch lawyers have settled all the previous actions at enormous expense. I mean, there's a discussion going on now about because of the actions that Rupert's taking to try and pass on control to Lachlan and miss out the 3 other kids in the empire. There's a discussion going on about, well, what is the Murdoch? How well is the Murdoch empire run, and what is it really worth? Well, as a question of assets and damage to assets, the hacking thing is so, and I've got this from a very good inside source, the hacking has now, so far, in settlements and legal fees, cost the Murdochs £1.9 billion. Listen, think about that. Over the years that they've been dealing with these actions, and of course it meant that the Sun virtually made no profits because for several years because of all this money flowing out. So they've got to. It's coming to a crunch now. And so, as you can find out by reading Harry's book, it's all in there. Harry set out to take this on. He said in the public interest, not just his own interest. And there's some fascinating paragraphs in the book about his discussion with his father about doing this. And his father said to him, the king said to him, "You can't do this. No, you can't. You can't control the press. It's folly to think you can." So, in other words, his father was making the plea that it's better to sleep with the devil than stand up against the devil. Harry's made the enormous, gigantic choice of standing up against the devil. He says, in the public interest, that this practice should be stopped.
He's had this. This has marked Harry's whole life, and it was so. There are still stories that haven't properly come out about his mother and what was done to her and what was done to her reputation, which Harry knows, which the Spencers know all about, which is why, of course, when Harry comes to London, the Spencers all line up to come stay with us. We're on your side.
Yeah.
You know, the Diana Wars are not over, actually.
No, they're not. And the interesting thing, the Mirror executives, of whom Rebecca Brooks is the most prominent involved in this whole saga, she says that what Harry's trying to do, and she attacks the whole action of Harry, as do the Murdochs, as an attempt to regulate the press, as to introduce new regulations on the behaviour of the press. It's not that. There are laws to do that, effective laws to do that. And the fact is that the Murdochs criminalise the newsrooms of the tabloids, and all Harry is asking for is legally sound journalism. He's not asking for any new laws to impose. He's just asking journalists to observe the laws that already exist, and most journalists do that. It's only a few rogue newspaper proprietors and editors, or basically the tabloids, but they've been shocked into submission by these actions. I mean, they've all
of
been.
Of course, this is me, not you, my theories. But hey, it's my podcast now. Some of the worst people, the people who are going to be in the dock and who've had to give account for themselves, were the ones who were in power when the press and the palace were like this. I mean, literally going on holiday together. Top editors, regulators, spin doctors from the palace. A dark time. Harry knows all about that time. actually, and especially.
Well, I know about that too. That so-called the press watchdog was tipping off Murdoch that there's nothing to worry about.
Well, no. How interesting. Well, for us, say goodbye. So you're very kind to give me this quick 20 minutes as a catch up. I want to just say something else, which I discovered about you, which I should have done but didn't. Is that A, we're both aviation nerds, and B, you're one of the best informed writers in the world on Boeing and what Boeing has been doing in recent decades. So I'm really hoping you'll come on soon and give us a lot more on that.
Well, that's a lovely story. And I had the privilege of interviewing 20 or so of the great engineers at Boeing who brought them into the jet age with the 707 in the 1950s and took them all the way up to the 747 in the 1980s. So I know that whole story. What made that? I know what made the company exceptional and great. I know what destroyed it.
Is it destroyed, or is it just in crisis?
It's destroyed. I mean, it's been strip mined. So the new guy has to rebuild it from scratch.
Okay, something for us all to look forward to, because Boeing was one of those companies. If you were a pilot, as I was 20, 30 years ago, Boeing was, if it ain't Boeing, I'm not going. It was the absolute benchmark of technical engineering excellence, run by pilots, not by accountants.
That's right.
And something changed. Okay. And you will tell us all that very soon.
I will.
Thanks for your time. I think you've driven away all my remaining royalist fans, but there you go. Yeah. Good to talk to you. Bye. Well, there you are. That's Clive. Good mate. And I can't wait to talk to him about Boeing. One for the aviation nerds, but actually not just for the aviation nerds. Anybody interested in passenger safety, which is pretty much everybody who's ever stepped on a plane. So that'll be interesting. But yeah, lots to think about. And I never expect people to agree with everything we say on here. Enjoy the back and forth. Used to enjoy it with Andrew, enjoy it with you, the commentators, and enjoy it with the guests. And talking of back and forth, let's talk about American politics. What a week it's been for that. Another assassination attempt on Trump. Shocking, really. And slightly shocking, too, the reaction to it. I mentioned Christopher Hitchens, my old mate. I mean, we weren't best friends. We were on lunching terms and occasional interview terms, but we knew each other reasonably well. And we had some really interesting conversations. It was impossible to have a boring conversation with Christopher. But like I said earlier in the show, this thing about not being able to distinguish between positions on your own side is so prevalent now. And I read something really interesting about the assassination attempt by John Podhoretz, who is American viewers will know him better than me. I think he's the editor of Commentary magazine. It's a conservative magazine. He's no fan of Trump, I don't believe. I think he's one of those people that was appalled when Trump refused to accept the result of the election in 2020. But he wrote this really interesting article about what he called the dark wish fulfillment that this assassination attempt had kind of elicited from many people on the left in America. Now, we're going to be talking to Nick Bryant in a minute. I don't think anybody would call Nick left-wing. I think he's going to give us a pretty strong anti-Trump analysis. But I will say to Nick that it isn't all the pathologies, the violence, the bad language, the furious partisanship. I don't think you can just blame that on Trump. I think he probably exploited it in his rise to power. But this has been building for a long time, and it comes from the left as well as the right. I think we have to accept that. And John Podhoretz, in his article, said, let's talk, and my Hebrew is terrible, let's talk tashlis, as we say in Hebrew, he says. Let's talk straight. The reason so many people in this country seem determined not to consider the profound seriousness of what looks like a new age of assassinations is that it represents a dark wish fulfillment for many people. Trump refused to go away. He lost an election. He wouldn't stand down. He wouldn't allow for a peaceful transition. He created chaos and danger. And the minute the next president began to serve, he ran again, straight away. Something nobody in his position has done for many, many years, decades, perhaps. People hate him. They revile him. They despise him. And many of them just want him to go away. But what's been missing from the coverage of this latest assassination, according to John, is the horror of it, because a lot of people just not horrified. They have a dark fantasy. And the more they talk about it, the more people want to fulfill it. And that's what he says. And he says himself, I wish Trump would retire. I don't like what he's done to the Republican Party. I wish he'd accept the result of the last election, etc., etc., etc. But he was very angry at some of the coverage. He mentions the Washington Post. I haven't read what it said, but apparently it said, Trump shouldn't go golfing. That's the real threat to him. Well, come on. That isn't the real threat, is it? The real threat is that America's got itself to a position where these kind of attacks seem, well, not normal, but regular, to be expected. Not a good thing. And which is a perfect introduction to Nick's book, which is so interesting. It's his account of his time in America and how he sort of fell out of love, like a lot of people from my part of the world and from Australia, where Nick's also from. We all grew up with an obsession with America. America was everywhere in our media. America did cool things. It went to the moon. It had movie stars. It had rock and roll. And then it had Reagan, and whatever your politics, he was a great man. And he changed the world probably for the better, and probably changed America for the better too. Then we had Clinton, and we all liked him. He helped with the Northern Ireland peace process. But it's got, I don't know, was it the Gulf War? Was it the Obama years? Or was it Trump? Was it social media? There's a kind of anger, what Nick calls America's forever war with itself, which I think has left him rather feeling like his love affair with that country is over. So whatever you think, if you're American or not, I hope you find what he has to say interesting. And I will promise to challenge him now and again. All right. See you at the end of the program. Thanks. Nick, hello. Welcome.
Phil, it's great to be here.
Well, you're speaking to me from one of my favorite places where I used to live, Sydney, and I'm very jealous. Which part are you in?
Oh, look, I'm going to make you even more jealous, I think, Phil, because I'm speaking to you from Bondi.
Oh.
And at the end of an absolutely glorious day, one of the first days of spring here, and it's been absolutely fabulous. I was back in Britain, actually, only a week ago, and it was rainy. It was windy. I was at a wedding in Scotland, and, winter in Sydney.
I don't know why I ever came back. And unfortunately, Mrs. Craig loves her children, and that was it. I'm afraid we had to come back.
Well, look, the tyranny of distance and all that kind of thing. But it is a long way away from Britain, but it's a beautiful part of the world to live.
All right. Well, I'm going to leap into your wonderful book, which thank you very much for sending me the copy. And I'm going to start by quoting you to yourself. Seemed like a good way to start. Here you go. Nick Bryant says, during the Trump years especially, I felt like I had already said goodbye to the America I had fallen in love with as a teenager. But perhaps the country that so beguiled me had always been a kingdom of my mind, a mythic city upon a hill. Perhaps I was saying goodbye to something that never truly existed. Do you still feel that?
Well, Phil, first of all, good for you. It sounds like you've read the book, because that is actually the last page. Look, I mean, I fell in love with America when I went there in 1984. It was on the eve of the Los Angeles Olympics. It was the summertime of American resurgence, really, after the long national nightmare of Vietnam and Watergate and the Iranian hostage crisis. That was the summer, really, that America got its mojo back. You remember the Rocket Man flying into the LA Coliseum, 84 grand pianos playing Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. I was completely intoxicated. I didn't fall in love with America at that moment. I'd already fallen in love with America. This consummated my relationship. But yeah, I mean, by the end of my time in America, I started to associate it with the negative aspects of American exceptionalism, the gun crime, the sort of police brutality, the extreme polarization and division. And if you excavate the past, which is what I do in the book, you realize, well, this isn't that new. I mean,
well, no, that's what I like. I write history as well. Where you weave in history all the way back to Washington and before, and bits of Hamilton and goodness knows what, to show that some of the kind of traumas and pathologies of modern America have always been there. And maybe, the decades you're talking about, the 80s, the 90s, perhaps that was the exception, not the rule.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the point of that quote, really. I mean, I kind of was there at a kind of unusual time of national unity. I mean, the LA Olympics, do you remember? America won virtually every medal, it seemed. The Soviets boycotted, as America had boycotted the Moscow Games 4 years earlier. I always remember there was a McDonald's scratch card promotion. If America won a gold in an event that you scratched off, you got a Big Mac. A silver would get you fries. A bronze would get you a Coke. And America was winning golds in events they never even sort of ranked in before, like Greco-Roman wrestling. And I just ate pretty much for free the entire summer. And it was the summer of USA, USA, that chant that you heard from, go from coast to coast, really. It was the first time that chant had really sort of been shouted at sporting events. And, to this day, whenever I hear it, I kind of expect somebody to hand me a free burger.
Well,
and America was incredibly...
Sorry.
Well, no, America was politically pretty united. Ronald Reagan won 49 out of 50 states in that year's election, his re-election. It's Morning Again in America was his slogan, which perfectly encapsulated the spirit of the time. But yeah, that was a kind of exception, really, because division has always been the default.
Yes, well, I mean, there's a new movie coming out. Dennis Quaid, It Will Be Reagan, and apparently it's very good, and it'll remind us all of that time. But of course, I mean, I think you and I could sit here and furiously agree about lots of things. A lot of the things you say about modern America, I would agree with, but I've got a lot of conservative friends. Maybe I'm a bit more conservative myself than perhaps I used to be. And I would probably say to you this, one thing you don't cover in great detail in your book are the pathologies of the left and how they perhaps have fed in to some of the things that you find so distasteful in the kind of Trump years.
Yeah, look, I think that's probably a fair criticism, actually. I mean, I do deal with them, but not to the same extent that I deal with some of the problems of the right. Yeah, I
mean, is Trump, in a sense, a reaction to the sort of academic political left losing its connection to the kind of middle American, ordinary Americans? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, Craig, I think you get into a good point there, which is that not all of the people who vote for Trump are necessarily very keen on Trump. They hate the opposition, and they hate what the opposition stands for. And I think that's an absolutely crucial point. And that's a point I try to make in the book. It's a point I make very strongly in the book's sort of prequel, which was this book I wrote about the 50-year prehistory of Donald Trump, which was called When America Stopped Being Great. That was I deal with a lot more of those kind of pathologies of the left as you describe them in that book. So I didn't kind of want to repeat myself. I kind of went back 250 years in this book when kind of wokeism, or whatever you want to call it, wasn't such a thing, but there were forerunners of it. And that is definitely one of the reasons why people vote for Trump. I mean, I was talking about being at a wedding in Scotland. It was with a lot of American people who aren't going to be voting Democrat. They hate the idea of the Democrats, and it's partly because what they associate with the Democrats now, which is a kind of more secular country, a more woke country, all those kind of things that they want to stop really happening. And Trump is a great way of stopping those things from happening.
Did you read the Twitter files, the thing that Elon Musk commissioned and published once he took over Twitter? Did you ever get the chance to look at those? Because they're quite interesting for the light they shine on the last election and the Hunter Biden story, and how it was apparently there was a kind of connection between Democratic Party activists, various big tech companies, Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and they sort of agreed not to give it any airtime because they thought, it's a Russian hoax or something. And I don't know, that felt a bit smelly to me at the time. And of course, it feeds into the Trump argument that there's a massive conspiracy against him and it's all unfair. I just wondered what your take was on that.
Yeah, look, I thought that was an area of legitimate concern. I mean, like so many sort of stories in America right now, the Hunter Biden story on the right became this kind of this grand narrative, this grand conspiracy theory that I didn't think it rose to that kind of level or anywhere near it. But I think you're right to say that a kind of liberal-minded press didn't give it the airtime that it probably deserved. And I think maybe there was a lesson learned from 2016 and maybe an overcorrection. I mean, I think there was an acknowledgement amongst a lot of media organizations that they paid Hillary Clinton's email scandal far too much attention. I mean, the studies were done after the 2016 election, which showed that the email scandal or pseudo scandal of Hillary Clinton actually got more column inches than all of Trump's scandals combined. And there was a real laser effect with the email scandal. It was the scandal that on the Democratic side, every reporter always focused on, where with the Trump scandals, there was really a strobe effect, wasn't there? Did you go after Trump University? Did you go after the Miss Universe stuff? Did you go after, the allegations of racism? There was so much going on in Trumplandia that you could focus on that nothing got focused on with a laser-like intensity. And that's what happened with the email scandals. It also became a way for the media to demonstrate that it was unbiased, that it was impartial. It was the way of saying, well, we're going to cover Trump's scandals, but we're going to cover Hillary Clinton's scandal as well. And everybody again focused on the emails. So it became elevated into this huge drama that it wasn't really of that level. And maybe with the Hunter Biden laptop stuff, there was a kind of residual memory of
we don't want
that.
to go down that road again. Interesting. One of the parts of the book I found most shocking, actually, was you take a lot of time to explain that America has a long history. I think you say a long history of avoiding the democracy that it itself invented. The story of voter suppression and how that has, it says America has apple pie, and some of the stories about, you mentioned the Texas allowing a gun permit as ID, but not a university permit.
Yeah, I mean, who's got the gun permits? Republicans. Who's got the student ID? Democrats. Yeah, look, I mean, that's one of the great myths of America, that it's this kind of beacon of democracy and always has been. And the founding fathers really didn't believe in mass democracy. They spoke of an excess of democracy. The word democratical was used by John Adams, who was America's second president, as a slur. Alexander Hamilton, who's regarded as a great hero now and memorialized forever with that brilliant musical. He was one of these sort of aristocrats who believed in an elective monarchy. I mean, and they really wanted the democracy to be a closed shop. I mean, we the people wasn't a phrase and a statement of participatory intent. It was a phrase that in the modern parlance I think would mean body politic, and they really wanted to enclose that body politic in a very intricately designed straitjacket. So they came out with a lot of counter-majoritarian mechanisms like the Electoral College. So if you win the national vote, as Donald Trump didn't do in 2016, you can still win the presidency. And similarly, the Senate, 2 senators for every state, regardless of the size. Even in the early days of the Republic, there were big discrepancies in population, and yet they saw this again as a counter-majoritarian measure. And remarkably, it wasn't until 1965 that America actually achieved universal suffrage. I think that is shocking to many people, and most Americans probably don't even realize that. It was only then that Black Americans in the South could vote unhindered. And they had all these mechanisms to stop them voting, like literacy tests, where they'd be asked how many bubbles are in a bar of soap. They'd be asked to interpret arcane sections of the state constitution that legal scholars would find difficult. All of those things were banned. But the moment that legislation was passed, a kind of new assault began on democracy.
Do you think that's continuing?
Absolutely.
This coming election, is voter suppression still a major issue, do you think, a factor?
Totally. No, I mean, what happened after the 65 Voting Rights Act came into effect was they found new devices to stop people from voting, and they tried to find new ways of limiting the franchise, primarily to stop people of color from voting, because they were obviously a massive potential Democratic constituency. And in the early days, it was Southern Democrats who were spearheading this, the sort of racist wing of the Democratic Party, that over the years became Republican. It was this sort of great realignment in American political geography, that the once solid Democratic South, as we used to call it, became reliably Republican. And that was historically anomalous, of course, because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican and the South hated Abraham Lincoln for obvious reasons. But it was the Republican Party that really sort of went for it on the voter suppression stuff. And they were aided and abetted to an alarming degree by the Supreme Court. The last 2 Chief Justices of the Supreme Court have a terrible record on voting rights. John Roberts, the present head of the Supreme Court, his predecessor, William Rehnquist, both of them in their early days. Roberts in the Reagan Justice Department, Rehnquist as a lawyer. They'd really been heavily involved in trying to suppress the vote. And when they actually started to wield that extraordinary judicial power that they had, they did that too. I mean, one of the key rulings of the last sort of 15 years has been what's called the Shelby ruling. And that really gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act of an important provision. And yeah, I mean, I see January the 6th as a culmination of an attack on democracy that's been decades in the making. And it continued after the insurrectionists were cleared from Capitol Hill. I mean, almost 150 Republican lawmakers went back into the chambers where they fled for their lives from and voted to try and overturn the election. And then at the state level, you had these attempts again to try and suppress the vote and also to subvert the vote. An idea took hold that state legislatures can actually overturn the will of the people. And that's an alarming thought.
Well, it's interesting, the number of people who perhaps once would have been considered moderate or centrist Republicans, maybe J.D. Vance is one such person, feel in order to advance their careers now they have to embrace some of the more extreme things. For example, that the election was stolen. I mean, Liz Cheney, I met Liz Cheney once, had lunch with her. I mean, she's a tough woman. She's a conservative by any standard. I remember implying ever so politely that perhaps waterboarding wasn't her father's finest moment as a vice president. And she looked at me like she was going to waterboard me then and there. I mean, this is a tough woman, but she is now, she's a Republican in name only. She's a pinko lefty. She's been basically driven out of the movement. I mean, this is
it's amazing, isn't it?
Level of radicalization, I think.
But the people with the surname Cheney are now seen as the moderates in the movement, in the conservative movement. And they're still very conservative, as you say. But I mean, something happened after January the 6th, which was, rather than being a moment of Trumpian repudiation, it became a moment of further Republican radicalization. And people like Liz Cheney, who were the people who didn't accept the big lie and the people who rejected the idea of an American president inciting an American insurrection, which is what happened on January the 6th. They were purged from the party. And the people who have prospered are the people who have done Trump's bidding, the people who have become his enablers. And to have a future now in the American conservative movement and the Republican Party, you need to kiss Donald Trump's ring. And even people who on the day were, railing against him, Kevin McCarthy, who was then the House leader of the Republicans, he was ringing Trump frantically on January the 6th, cool off your attack dogs. A few weeks later, he's at Mar-a-Lago, basically kissing Donald Trump's ass. And, that's the tragedy for me, that people like J.D. Vance, who were fierce Trump critics, have become these Trump impersonators. And I think Vance, has got the zealotry of a convert as well. I think he's not just impersonating Trump anymore. He's become a convert.
And going back to the idea of the left having kind of American left or liberal elite or whatever phrase you want to use, having kind of prepared the ground for some of this. I do remember during the Black Lives Movement protests, which became extremely violent. No, I mean, it wasn't an attack on the central government, but there was some very, very unpleasant incidents. I remember there was a function, I think it was at the White House, where people were being attacked as they left. And a lot of American Democratic politicians, some of them were in Congress, were seeking to defend that. Oh, the people are angry, they need to express themselves. And again, I suspect that sort of thing, if you're inclined to want to support Donald Trump, gives you a justification. Well, they're doing it. Look at all that violence. They're not getting called out. I mean, is America itself just basically too tolerant of sort of street anger these days?
Well, certainly the slogan, defund the police, sort of came back to haunt the Democrats. And I think, one of the reasons why the Trump campaign was quite happy initially when Kamala Harris emerged as the nominee was that, they thought there was a sort of treasure trove of quotes of her sort of being quite supportive of that idea. And that would come back to haunt her. And yeah, I mean, what's happened in these moments, especially in race in America, is that white America will countenance sort of a level of equality, but But when you start introducing ideas like reparations and affirmative action, that's when the kind of white support starts to drain away. So even though there was white, almost universal condemnation of George Floyd's murder, I mean, even Trump sort of issued an executive order calling for sort of, new sort of police reforms and all that kind of stuff. In that moment, there was sort of a rare thing in America, which was a kind of almost a bipartisan consensus that something had to be done. But then you get the kind of defund the police stuff, and that kind of consensus falls apart. And that again has been a kind of a pattern in American history. There were these reforms of the civil rights era that, did have a lot of consensus around them, ending segregation, giving African Americans the vote. But when African Americans started campaigning for affirmative action and for reparations, that was just something that was harder to coalesce a majority view around. And defund the police is another classic example of that.
One of the parts of your book I found particularly interesting because, I worked at the BBC on and off for many years, as you did. You sort of fall foul of the BBC complaint system, and the lesson you take from that is actually that everybody was trying to be too even-handed and holding back from saying, no, he's not just a kind of funny extremist, this man Trump. He's not a sort of a rogue. He's actually a potential dictator.
The specifics of that, and I'd preface this with I love the BBC. I wouldn't want to give the opponents of the BBC any sort of ammunition to take on the BBC. But I did have a go at the complaints unit, which is a separate entity from BBC News. And on this issue, actually, BBC News backed me to the hilt. I described Donald Trump giving himself 10 out of 10 for his handling of the COVID pandemic as a ridiculous boast. And that's what they found against me on. Now, to not say it was ridiculous, it seemed to me was ridiculous. After all, this was a guy who was suggesting that we inject ourselves with bleach. This was a guy who was calling it the Chinese flu. This was a guy who was fiercely opposed to lockdowns in the early days when they were working and stopping the spread of the disease. This was a guy that really thought this is just a kind of mild flu. You really don't have to be worried about it. That wasn't a 10 out of 10 for me. There wasn't even a 9 or an 8 out of 10. It was a kind of, but having given himself 10 out of 10, that to me was a ridiculous boast. And they found against me on that. And what they also said was that I should have offset my criticism of Trump with kind of more criticism of the Democrats and Joe Biden. And that seemed to me a kind of odd false equivalence there. What was I supposed to do? Find a kind of somewhere where Joe Biden had said something equally daft? Well, he hadn't. That was the problem. And I found that really crazy. And, impartiality doesn't mean you can't say strong things. Another episode was when Trump told those 4 congresswomen of color to go back to where they came from, right? 3 of them were born in America. One of them was a naturalized American from the age of 13, I think. That's textbook racism when you tell somebody to go back to where they came from. And the BBC had this kind of weird editorial policy on that one, which was the programs themselves could decide whether they wanted to call it racist or not. So you had this kind of ludicrous situation where I was appearing on the Radio 4 6 o'clock news and calling it racist. PM decided they didn't want to use that word. The 10 o'clock news, racist. BBC Online didn't want to use racist. It was just, that was daft to me. We just should have had a uniform policy on that was BBC wide, but we didn't. And it spoke of a kind of institutional timidity, I think. We really didn't want to, I think especially post-Brexit, offend some of the people in Britain who kind of like the idea of Trump. And criticism of Trump was almost seen as sort of criticism of Brexiteers as well. It was like the two were conflated, that they were transatlantic twins. And I think there was a lot of institutional timidity.
Well, I guess the Farage friendship with Trump would probably have driven that a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. But just to for instance, if Trump was a European politician, we call him far right, but we don't call him far right. And I think we could, I think we could use the word wannabe authoritarian around Trump. I think we could use the word authoritarian around Trump.
Because I just checked Real Clear Politics. It's neck and neck. We're talking in early September. It's neck and neck. And that's neck and neck after, Harris has had a bit of a bounce. So there's got to be a chance he'll win. I mean, and if he does, what do you fear the most? Or do you think he might actually try and govern in a different way this time?
There's a total chance he'll win. I think, if you look at Nate Silver's probabilities at the moment, I think Trump is slightly ahead. And, one of the reasons that he stands such a good chance of winning is obviously the Electoral College. We were talking about the sort of flaws of American democracy earlier. He doesn't have to win the nationwide vote in order to win. And a lot of his support comes from those 3 Rust Belt states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. A lot will be dependent by Pennsylvania. In fact, I'd suggest that whoever wins Pennsylvania will win the presidency. If he can lock Kamala Harris out of those 3 states, then he's going to win. So he's saying there's a strong likelihood. How will it differ from the last time? Well, I think one of the key things is that there were a lot of moderating influences in the last administration. There were grown-ups in the room who either tried to thwart him or not actually go through with some of his executive orders and decisions. And they really tried to restrain his sort of worst impulses and his worst decisions. And those people aren't going to be around the second time around. He's going to pack that administration with loyalists. He's going to pack the West Wing with loyalists. And one of the big things about Project 2025, of course, is to purge the whole federal government, the whole administrative system of people who are going to stand in his way. And that I think is what makes Trump so worrying the second time round.
I mean, looking on from the perspective of this side of the Atlantic, my main concern would be Ukraine. But I don't know whether
for sure.
Has that been overhyped? I mean, would he really try and stitch them up, do you think, and sell them out to Putin?
There's a really strong isolationist spirit now within the Republican Party. What would have been sort of unthinkable to a Republican like George W. Bush or George Herbert Walker Bush or Ronald Reagan is now kind of pretty mainstream Republican thinking. And, J.D. Vance has said, I really don't care about Ukraine. Trump said he could end the war on day one, but ending the war on day one would be granting massive territorial concessions to Vladimir Putin or possibly giving him the green light to march on Kyiv. And then what happens in Taiwan? What does that mean for other authoritarian around the world with sort of, ambitions?
Is it because Trump doesn't care, or is it because he thinks the world would be better organized if powerful men like him and Putin just carved everything up in a kind of 19th century, scramble for Africa kind of way? Is that his vision, or is the word vision wrong will apply to him in foreign policy?
I don't think there is necessarily a vision. I think he thinks that America gets taken advantage of by its allies. I think that's why he hates NATO. He doesn't think that the allies stump up enough cash for their own defense, that they're ripping off America. I think that's one of the things that drives his thinking on foreign policy. I think you're right. The international leaders who he has most regard for are authoritarians, the Putins, the Xi Jinpings, the Mohammed bin Salmans, the King Jong-un. Little Rocket Man became his kind of his buddy in North Korea. And the people who he really kind of mocked and undermined were the closest allies. I mean, he treated Theresa May appallingly. Openly talked about her being ousted and Boris Johnson, his mate, taking over. Justin Trudeau, another long-standing friend of America, he treated him with disdain. Malcolm Turnbull in Australia, who was then the Prime Minister, had the right idea. He stood up to Trump in their first telephone conversation, famously. And but I think the leaders that tried to sort of bow down before him, like Theresa May, she was far too sort of worried about the kind of special relationship, and she sort of tiptoed around Donald Trump. They just got pilloried and mocked and undermined. And he likes fellow strongmen.
I mean, is there anything about America now that you kind of miss? I mean, you lived there long enough. You've written this book, which is kind of like a goodbye to all that kind of a book. But there's a lot of sort of fondness in it, but it's more nostalgia, I'd say, than about the America of today. Are you just really over it now, do you think?
Oh, look, I miss the dynamism of the place. I always felt more comfortable in America than I did in Britain, to be honest. I mean, I kind of believed in the American dream. In fact, I lived a version of my own American dream. I always wanted to be a BBC Washington correspondent. And, thankfully, I got the chance to do that, not just for the Trump years, but, going back to Clinton and Bush and Obama and Biden. I got to cover the last 5 presidents, which was amazing. And I love the kind of the social mobility. I love the lack of snobbery. I love the fact that people aren't judging you the moment you open your mouths, all the things that we associate with life in Britain, maybe. I mean, I love Britain too. But yeah, there are things I miss. And, I say in the book, I only had to knock on the door of our next door neighbors to be reminded of the kind of hopeful America. I mean, this was a family. His dad had come to America as an immigrant from China. He'd become this kind of .com millionaire in the kind of early days of the internet. His wife came from a blue-collar family in Massachusetts. The daughter was making a name for herself in Hollywood. The son was at the powerhouse university in America. I mean, all the things that you kind of associate with the positive side of America, they were right on our doorstep. Our next door neighbors were living that American dream. And so I don't kind of totally write off the country by any means. And I kind of look at the kind of the theater and the kind of craziness of the balloon drops at conventions and, the speechifying, which is just kind of, is still kind of electrifying to me. I mean, after, watching British politicians, I kind of love the kind of showmanship of American politics, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so there are lots of things I miss.
It's as we know, it's famously cutthroat society. There's not much of a safety net there, but also it delivers economic growth. I mean, America has been growing faster than pretty much anywhere else since the pandemic. And you go there, you roll the dice, you take your chances. I remember reading P.J. O'Rourke, the conservative satirist, who used to say that outside every American embassy, there are 2 queues. At the front, they're burning the American flag, and at the back, they're queuing for green cards. And the people are often interchangeable between the two, because it is still a place where you can take a chance, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that kind of, I mean, a lot of the things that cause America's problems, I mean, like immigration, for instance, are obviously the things that promote and drive that growth. The American economy wouldn't be the economy it is without the influx of immigrants, whether they're lowly paid or highly educated. One thing I would say about the economy, though, is that political polarization is very much a product of income polarization. And I think for the last 50 years, one of the problems has been that division in wealth has just become far more extreme. The level of CEO pay compared to shop floor pay, in the 50s and the 60s, there wasn't the huge discrepancy that there is today. I think one of the problems of the Clinton years was he granted so many concessions to Reaganism when it came to regulating the market that he really pushed for deregulation of Wall Street, which really was a major factor in the financial crash in 2008. And one thing that Clinton also did, he refused to regulate the digital economy. And again, I think that was a big mistake. I think a lot more could have been done to build a new economy that was more equitable. And I think that is one of the big problems in America right now, that there's a kind of missing middle in American politics, partly because there's a missing middle in the economy.
Interesting. I'm running out of time here. I'm going to let you go back to your Bondi evening. But one last question. Do you think, if Harris wins, which I'm guessing you hope she will, if Harris wins, do you think she has the making of somebody who could be a Clinton, a Reagan, an inspirational figure that might help heal these divisions that you write so well about? Because I'm not sure I do, from what I've seen of her.
No, I don't think so either, and not through any great fault of her own. I just don't think that any figure could be transcendent and unifying. I think that's where we are right now. That's why I call this book The Forever War, America's Unending Conflict with Itself. I think we made that mistake with Barack Obama. We thought this was a kind of end of history moment for America. The original sin of slavery has finally been absolved. Grace has taken America home, Amazing Grace, all that kind of stuff. And of course, what we were really witnessing was not the end of history, but a kind of a counterattack, a conservative counter-revolution. And, who was at the head of it? Well, the untitled leader of the birther movement, the figure who actually questioned whether Barack Obama was a legitimate US president. And that, of course, was Donald Trump. And I think you'd see something similar if Kamala Harris wins. There wouldn't be a kind of end of history moment. There wouldn't be a problem solved moment. It would just be a new problem, and there'd be a new counterattack. And you're just in this cycle right now, that one side will be up, the next side will come back, and then, history will repeat itself. And, Lincoln said America cannot escape its history. And I think that's the problem it finds itself in right now. And, one way of thinking about the American divide is, there's a lot of people in America who really believe they're victims of America's past. Many of them people of color who are obviously going to gravitate towards Kamala Harris. And there are many people who think they are victims of America's future. A country that's more woke, a country that's more secular, a country that's going to be majority minority by mid-century. And the person to stop that future happening is Donald Trump. So you are in a situation right now. I don't think that America is going to end up in civil war, but I don't think it's going to end up in a state of civil peace.
Very well done. Very interesting. Good wrap up. Coming in perfectly on time, like a real professional. Excellent. Oh, look, thanks so much. I'm sure
it's great to chat.
There'll be another book in it for you, no doubt. What happens? I hope so. Anyway.
Well, it'd be nice to write a trilogy, but it's But in order to write the trilogy, I fear Trump would have to win. I don't want that to happen. No,
I don't think. All right. Very good to talk to you. And,
come and see us in Bondi.
Oh God, I would love to. See you next week.
We'll blow the froth off a cold one or whatever they say.
Lovely. I've got my stubby holder ready. Take care, mate.
Take care. Love it as fuck. Bye-bye.
Well, there you have it. From Bondi Beach to Twickenham, which is a journey I guess I took a few years ago. I think I would have stayed in Australia, actually, if it was down to me. But unfortunately, Mrs. Craig loves our children. And there you are. Okay, I love them too. And it's great being back here and having grandkids to play with and the like. But there's something wonderful about Australia that I do miss. Okay, thank you for staying with me in this marathon episode. So interesting, I think. I don't want it just to be a topical news show. And definitely next week I'll do something very different. It might well be the abdication crisis. But I'm actually talking in a day or two to an author of a book about cricket. Now that'll divide the audience. Half of the world doesn't know what cricket is. And the rest of the world, well, they certainly don't think it's scandalous. It has a reputation of being very gentlemanly and old-fashioned, and it's kind of tea and scones and long summer afternoons and lazy and slow. But actually, there's a great character called Bill Edrich from the 1930s, which is one of my favourite eras, who lived a very scandalous life. So maybe it'll be that one. If it's not next week, it'll be soon. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. As ever, appreciate all your comments. Do keep liking, do keep commenting, do keep subscribing. I'm still not moving very fast towards 10,000. I really want to get there. Anything you can do to help will be appreciated. And then if you found the last hour interesting, stimulating, or just infuriating, well, if you're infuriating, then just forgive me. But if you found it interesting, there's always a little button for a couple of dollars if you're feeling in the mood. But thank you. Appreciate your company. See you again soon. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.